but I have always defended Notre Dame's scheduling approach because, my goodness, when 2018 hit and they made it through undefeated and reached the playoff, people were saying the schedule was a bit light this year. Well, it had nothing to do with Notre Dame's approach to scheduling because it's always loaded. It was that Florida State was down, Virginia Tech was down, Stanford was down, USC was down.
Right.
And then I'm looking at this year's schedule. We don't need to defend Notre Dame's schedule. It's one of the top 5 in the nation almost every year. The one thing I'll ask you, Brian, and you, Nathan, as well, is there anything that you don't like about not necessarily this year's particular schedule, but about the approach to scheduling?
I think at times Notre Dame doesn't do its football team any favors by how they'll load up November being on the road the entire time. I think it was 2-3 years ago, they were on the road, I think 4 or 5 of their last 5 or 6 games. And I think those are some of those things that can be challenging. I think it was 2015. They had to play like at Temple, at Boston College, at USC, or at Stanford, like 3 of their last 4 games. And it was a challenge because that's a lot of travel when you're late in the season and you're already wearing down and you're already more injury prone. So I would like to see them be more balanced there. But that's the challenge, Mark, of trying to fit a 12-game schedule against conference teams that have to work around their conference's schedule. So it's just going to happen that way sometimes, but sometimes you can get a little too home heavy at the beginning, which makes you road heavy at the end, or vice versa. So but I like their new scheduling approach because they're not just loading up with Septembers. I mean, I felt bad for Bob Davie. He was a bad coach, but I mean, there were years where he was playing 4 or 5 top 25 teams before they even got out of September. And now they have those big games early. They had Georgia, last year, for example, in 2019, but they surrounded it with like Louisville and New Mexico and Bowling Green, which takes some of that week after week after week burden that nobody else does because everybody else has that, that FCS built in, or Ohio State will play a really play a really good team at the beginning and then play like 3 cream puffs until the Big Ten schedule starts. And then the Big Ten, for some reason, always seems to give them like Rutgers and Illinois at the beginning of the Big Ten schedule, but there's some challenges, but there's also some advantages too. Notre Dame gets a chance to kind of be more loose with their schedule maybe than other teams can. They can truly determine all 12 teams on the schedule, but I like the approach that they've had recently. And I think we're going to find out that scheduling philosophy in 2022 and 23, when they've got to play Clemson, Ohio State, and USC all in both of those years. That's going to be interesting, a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I mean, I echo a lot of what Brian said there. I know, they always end in California. That's something that, I mean, they're used to at this point, but at the same time, it'd be nice to, I think, what was it, this year was the first time they had their home game, their last home game in November.
I think it was since like 90, the last time was a Hawaii game back when Ron Paulus was, I think, the quarterback, was the last time that they did not end the season at Stanford or California.
And I mean, it's nice from a weather standpoint. I can vouch for that because, and I like it as a fan because living out here in the West Coast, I pretty much go to every Stanford or USC game every year, on the road, I should say. So from that standpoint, I love it. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the one thing, I was sort of I grew up in a household that loved the traditional rivals, the Michigan State and Purdue specifically. I was never really huge on the Michigan rival as some Notre Dame fans are. And I think me and Brian have kind of had this discussion in the past.
We agree on it though, by the way. I could care less about the Michigan series.
Exactly. So I
could not care less. Sorry.
I wish they played Purdue and Michigan State maybe a tiny bit more. And I was sad to an extent when that kind of ended, at least the streak ended, I should say. I think they're coming back here on the schedule in the next couple of years, which is nice. But I love the coast to coast outside of the having to travel coast to coast, if that makes any sense. But kind of like what Brian said a little bit earlier with, having the ACC maybe be a better conference for Notre Dame in general. I love, playing Georgia one week and then all of a sudden you're playing, I know Washington State or something like that, whoever it is, it's just a different, it's a different scheduling than anybody else does. And that's what makes Notre Dame unique. And that's not really even from like a bias standpoint. It's just kind of just true and factual. So that part of Notre Dame's schedule, I really enjoy. But and so I wouldn't change too much of it. But I think they can maybe do some better things for their athletes specifically if they were able to adjust, maybe going from coast to coast on a weekly basis.
One thing I would like to see change is I wouldn't mind seeing them get rid of Stanford as a yearly opponent. Maybe make Stanford be on there for like a couple home and homes over a decade. And I'd like to see them kind of loosen that up and maybe play more Pac-12 teams, do a home and home at UCLA do a home and home at Oregon, do a home and home in Washington, then bring Stanford back into that rotation a little bit. I don't think Stanford does a whole lot for Notre Dame. It did during a short period of time during the David Shaw era because they were good and it gave Notre Dame a big win. But that's not who Stanford's going to be moving forward. We're already seeing that kind of fall back. They took advantage of the Pac-12 being down, other than Oregon, and did a great job. And I think they did some things that were unique, which made it harder to stop them. But they're fading back, and I just don't know what playing Stanford does for Notre Dame. I'd like to see them mix that up. I'd like to see them, maybe get a little bit more involved in Texas, get TCU on the schedules, something like that. Get a Big 12 opponent a little bit more often than they have. And I would like to see there be a Big 10 home and home every 2 years. I'd like to see them mix up Purdue and Indiana and Michigan State. The Michigan State-Purdue rivalries are one that I especially miss. Because I think to me, for Michigan State, there's also there's a little bit of loyalty there with Michigan State that you kind of have with Navy, because they were the one Big 10 team that kind of had your back when you were trying to get in back in the day. So Michigan State's a team that I wouldn't mind seeing get back on a schedule with a little bit more regularity. USC and Navy are the only opponents I care about having on it every year, but I would like to see the Spartans and the Boilermakers a little bit more than what we plan to see over the next decade.
Our mission is – go ahead, Nathan.
I wouldn't even mind, because I know part of the reason they like Stanford is obviously the kind of them being the other parallel school that is really good academically and also has had some really good football, has a pretty good history of football and just different things like that, or at least recently, I should say, more so for Stanford. I wouldn't mind them kind of interchanging like Northwestern with Stanford every now and then, if that's kind of what you want to do, because Northwestern obviously is another program that I wouldn't say necessarily a traditional rival of Notre Dame, but they played them a lot, and I would consider them at least a Midwest rival. And they're obviously very high academic as well. So that wouldn't bother me, kind of, if you want to kind of keep an academic standard to it. Switching that off every year or bringing in another program on a yearly basis, playing Vanderbilt more often from an academic standpoint. And a lot of the ACC schools are really good academically, so you kind of get that already. But I kind of like that aspect of it if you're going to take Stanford off the schedule, at least on a yearly basis.